This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about a system that is still moving. Even as the people at the top stop speaking the same language, what you are seeing right now is not conflict. It's misalignment. Quiet, technical, dangerous. Because when the political layer sends one signal and the institutional layer sends another, the system doesn't freeze, it compensates. And compensation is how failure hides. What makes this moment different is not volume, it's location. These warnings are no longer whispered. They are being delivered in public spaces designed for allies, adversaries, and history to hear at the same time. That alone should make you pause, because systems only do that when internal correction has failed. If you're watching closely, stay with me. This is the part people miss, and it only gets harder to see from here. I want you to notice something subtle. The system is no longer being driven by elected rhetoric. It's being stabilized by institutional muscle memory. What actually holds this structure together right now is not speeches or votes or slogans. It's procedure, habit, decades of interoperable planning built to survive leadership churn. That's the control layer most people never see. When alliances function, it's because thousands of small decisions assume trust will still exist tomorrow. Shared production, shared logistics, shared threat perception. But that assumption is now under stress, so the system adapts. It shifts weight downward, away from politics, toward commanders, planners, and operational coordination. That is not strength. That is load-bearing substitution. Because the moment institutions are forced to publicly reaffirm what politics no longer guarantees, the balance changes. You're watching the system reveal what it's protecting. And by doing that, it's also revealing what it's afraid of losing. Hold that thought, because the danger didn't arrive suddenly. It arrived quietly. For a long time, this system worked because it didn't have to announce itself. Before alignment was assumed, coordination was invisible. Deterrence functioned quietly in the background like electricity. You only noticed it when it failed. Now compare that to what's happening. Before, adversaries were managed by distance. Separated, kept from syncing their timelines, their logistics, their ambitions. Now that separation is gone, not because of a treaty, not because of a breakthrough, but because the cost of alignment has dropped slowly, incrementally, normalized. The most dangerous changes never feel dramatic. They feel administrative. They arrive as phrasing shifts, as priorities reframed, as cooperation elsewhere becomes optional instead of assumed. What used to be implicit is now being restated out loud, again and again, publicly. That's the tell. When a system starts narrating its own importance, it's not performing confidence. It's compensating for erosion. And erosion doesn't announce itself as collapse. It announces itself as continuity. Which is why the next moment matters. Because this wasn't theoretical anymore. It showed up as stress. There was a moment when this stopped being abstract. Not a speech, not a policy paper, a concrete signal. A senior operational voice stepped into an allied space and did something unusual. He didn't threaten. He didn't posture. He praised. He praised integration, shared production, joint capability, language that treats partners as co-authors, not vendors. That sounds benign. It isn't. Because praise at that altitude is diagnostic. It tells you what is scarce. When someone that high points to cooperation and says this is the model, what they're really saying is this model is under strain elsewhere. This wasn't about one country being good. It was about reminding the system what good still looks like. And then came the other half of the signal, the part that doesn't get said unless it has to, the acknowledgement that adversaries are no longer acting alone. They're coordinating, sharing logistics, sharing space, sharing time. That's not a warning, that's a status update. And status updates like that don't get issued unless the clock is already running. Here's the part most people never get to see, because it's boring, until it isn't. This system doesn't break through explosions, it breaks through flow. Deterrence works when supply chains, command structures, and political trust all move at the same speed. When one slows, the others compensate. Briefly. Right now, the damage isn't absorbed at the top, it's pushed outward. Alliances don't collapse, they stretch. Production becomes co-production. Risk becomes shared risk. Responsibility becomes distributed ambiguity. That's how the system keeps functioning while absorbing political shock. And here's the imbalance. The benefit of destabilizing rhetoric is concentrated, short-term, visible, domestic. The cost is diffuse, delayed. borne by planners, troops, infrastructure, and forward regions that don't get to opt out, so the system quietly reroutes pressure. Northward, outward, into regions where escalation is easier to manage than repair. That's not strategy, that's triage. And triage always means something else isn't getting treated, which is why the next stress point didn't arrive slowly. It arrived fast. The pace changes here, because now the system is reacting, not adjusting. Multiple signals start stacking, joint patrols. Shared vessels, overlapping timelines. You don't announce those unless you expect them to be seen. Airspace incidents increase. Navigation interference becomes routine. Infrastructure stops being background and becomes targetable. None of this is loud. That's the danger. It happens in technical language. Operational updates. Readouts that sound procedural until you realize how many of them there are. And notice where this pressure concentrates. Cold regions. Thin margins. Places where response time matters more than rhetoric. The system responds by tightening coordination. New commands, realigned boundaries, faster integration. Again, this looks like strength, but it's also exposure, because every added layer of readiness is a signal in itself. It tells everyone watching that the margin is shrinking. And when margins shrink, miscalculation doesn't need intent. It just needs timing. This is the moment where stability becomes fragile, not because someone wants conflict, but because too many actors are now sharing the same clock. Hold on to that. Because next, this stops being about institutions. It becomes about you. This is where the abstraction drops away, because systems don't absorb stress evenly. They pass it down. You feel it as uncertainty, as higher prices tied to places you've never been, as security decisions made farther away, faster, with less margin for error. You feel it when stability becomes conditional, when routine quietly disappears from the language. You are not being prepared for panic. You're being normalized to risk. That's how this works. The deterrence system is designed so you don't notice it until it has to speak out loud. And now it is, publicly, calmly, professionally. That should unsettle you, because when institutions start addressing everyone at once, they're not educating. They're signaling endurance. If this matters to you, and it should, don't look away here. This is the hinge point, because the consequences don't stop at borders. They ripple, and the next ripple doesn't ask permission before it spreads. Zoom out. Because at this point, containment is no longer geographic. What happens in one region now immediately recalibrates another. Shipping lanes open, resource maps redraw themselves. Military presence follows economics, not the other way around. Coordination that once took years now takes months, sometimes weeks. And the same convergence you're seeing among adversaries is being mirrored carefully by allies trying to keep pace. That's the paradox. The tighter the global system becomes, the less forgiving it is. There is no buffer zone anymore, only overlap. Regions that used to be peripheral are now load-bearing. Places once treated as margins become hinges, which means missteps don't stay local. They propagate. A signal meant for one audience is heard by all. A recalibration in one theater forces adjustments everywhere else. This is what globalized deterrence looks like when it's stressed, not dramatic collapse, but synchronized vulnerability. And when multiple systems share exposure, the future stops being linear. It branches. Because from here, the system doesn't have one outcome, it has paths, and none of them are comfortable. From here, the system doesn't choose, it drifts. There are 3 paths visible now. All of them are already forming. The first is adjustment. Institutions keep compensating, alliances tighten procedures, deterrence holds, but only because everyone works harder to maintain what used to be automatic. This path looks stable until you realize how much strain it hides. The second is erosion. Trust thins without breaking. Coordination remains, but slower, more conditional. Adversaries don't need to win. They just need to wait while the system spends energy holding itself together. And then there is rupture. Not invasion, not collapse, but a moment where misalignment meets timing, where signaling fails, where an action meant as deterrence is read as provocation. That's how systems fail in the modern era. Not through intent, through compression. Which path emerges isn't decided by one leader or one election. It's decided by whether alignment can be restored faster than pressure accumulates. And that question, that unresolved tension, is still open. What makes this dangerous is not that anyone has lost control. It's that control is being maintained manually, in public, in real time, by institutions designed to operate quietly. That should tell you something, because systems don't warn unless warning is the last remaining tool. They don't speak this clearly unless silence has stopped working. Nothing you've heard resolves this. It shouldn't. The machinery is still moving. The alliances are still intact. The deterrence still functions, for now. But the gap between political signaling and institutional reality is no longer invisible, and gaps once exposed invite pressure. Not tomorrow, not suddenly, gradually, then all at once. So when you hear calm voices explaining readiness, don't confuse that with reassurance. It's endurance. If you want to understand where this goes next, you have to keep watching the system, not the personalities. Because the next shift won't announce itself as a crisis. It will arrive as another adjustment. And by the time it has a name, it will already be too late to pretend this wasn't happening. Stay with this. The next chapter is already forming.